This is not a drill. This is not a drill. General quarters. General quarters. All hands on your battle station.
Welcome to Midrats with Sal from Commander Salamander and Eagle One from Eagle Speak at Sea or Shore, your home for a discussion of national security issues and all things maritime. And good day, everybody. Great to have you aboard today for another live edition of Midrats. And if you are with us live, would like to go ahead and extend the invitation to you. If you are so inclined, we've got the live chat going. If you want to, you can head right over to there if you have some observations you would like to share during the course of the show, or there's some questions you would like for us to direct to our guest. That is the perfect place to go. And in the course of the show, if you got to run off and take care of business, go hydrate, get out of the sun, whatever you need to do. If you don't already, go over to iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Find us, we're there, and subscribe. That way you can catch the rest of the show, or if you can't catch us next time we're on, we will be waiting for you right there at a time that works best with your schedule. And we're going to just hop right into the show today. We're going to go back over a century, actually a century and a decade, to 2016. At that point, America was well out of the war, but Europe was a year and 10 months into what would be known as the Great War, or World War I, as most Americans will refer to it. The Battle of Verdun has already taken place, but the Battle of the Somme, especially for the British, has a lot of more resonance. It was just a month down the road. And even though it's been almost 2 years at war, the navies, these huge fleets that these nations had built the better part of a decade plus, getting ready to go to war, they had not really seen that great Mahanian fleet-on-fleet action. They're just kind of like two heavyweight boxers looking at risk, looking at reward, going around in circles, throwing a jab here and there, but nobody had really both stepped up to really slog it out. And then one early morning, the scouting force of the German Navy, led by Admiral Hitler, headed out of the Bight, headed north, and everything else took place. Of course, we're talking about the Battle of Jutland, and we're going to talk today with our guest, Simon Harley. And we're going to look back with Simon, not just the history, but maybe some of the things that we can take to today's lessons from watching and learning what has been written. And Simon has a great background to talk about that. He's not only a naval historian and associate fellow at the Royal Historical Society, but he's a co-editor of a great resource called the Dreadnought Project that I'll link to over in the show page. It's a superb online resource. And I don't know if we're going to talk about it, but his paying gig, he sells vintage British motorcycle spares. Simon, welcome to Midrat.
Thank you very much, Sal.
It's great to have you on, and we appreciate you working on Greenwich Mean Time with us as well. And I guess it's important, I said in the opening, it's 110 years, and that is quite a bit. And you're a couple years older than I am, but especially Mark and I, we were little kids. You still had a couple of World War I veterans that were holding on, but they're all gone. But it's interesting, even though it was 110 years ago, we don't have any living survivors. And it was and probably this is part of the reason, it was all these theorists had spent the late part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s coming up with how they would do this fleet, how they do these engagements, and it happened. But it was, I think, put it mildly, is indecisive. But it's amazing how much to this day people will get in sometimes rather heated arguments and discussions about one aspect or another. But before we go into some of those details, for the listeners that may not have that much of a diving in understanding of what the Battle of Jutland has in regards to time and place, kind of put where the Battle of Jutland was in time and place of the Great War.
it's been nearly 2 years of war, and you've got, on the naval side, there's not been so much going on because near the beginning of the war, the British effectively cut the Germans off from their maritime trade very quickly, apart from the occasional massive setbacks, such as the Battle of Coronel, which was the first massive Royal Navy defeat in 100 years, really. But after the end of 1914, beginning of 1915, it was concentrated on the North Sea. But of course, that's not to diminish what was going on land in France, in Belgium, in the Near East and Middle East.
Well, one of the questions that keeps arising about these kinds of situations is: are there lessons as we go along? Are there lessons for us in the present time that we can get from the Battle of Jutland? I know when I was a young midshipman in my ROTC class that we read about it, and since I think it was my freshman year, it made about as much sense as somebody talking about higher physics to me at the time.
The big lesson from Jutland, I think, is what was it a New York newspaper which said this afterwards, that the German fleet has assaulted its jailer, but it's still in jail. I think that's the main lesson from Jutland, which anyone can learn. The Germans thought that they had a good chance of whittling down the British fleet so much that they could break the British blockade, and they didn't. They tried, but they didn't.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges coming from America is we have this, and I'm going to share a couple of things that those that are with us on Riverside, you should be able to see them. But the one thing, it's hard to understand from an American perspective, at least, the scale that we're looking at. When you look at, the Battle of Jutland, we see pictures of the North Sea, and I'm just going to show everybody, most Americans, especially from a naval background, they're familiar with the Virginia Capes, VACAPES operating area, where you come out of Norfolk, and that's where everybody does their exercises and our war games. And you'll see up there, that's a 160 nautical mile circle right off of the Virginia Capes from an American point of view. And that doesn't even begin to look at what the Gulf Coast. I think you can fit about 3 of these circles in the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, depending upon which map you're looking at. But when you take that same, just to give everybody a little bit of that perspective there. If you look at that same 160 nautical mile circle up on the North Sea, lo and behold, that is from Denmark to the east coast of the UK, right near the Scottish-English border, and the northern, the Friesland part of Germany and the Netherlands. So when we're talking about a fleet action, it's not that large of an area. And in the work up to the battle, you see that circle, the actual operational area because of the minefields and other considerations, it's even smaller than that, the body of water these 2 huge fleets were running into each other in.
Yeah, it's interesting that I've had to, the last few days I've been going over as many Jutland maps as I can find in the old books, and what's also interesting is that the British fleet and the German fleet, they went back and forth over the same area again and again during the battle, and there was it's not just a battle as well. A few years later, before the end of the war, one man who survived the sinking of HMS Invincible, he was later attached to the battle cruiser Renown, if memory serves, and he wrote in the letter, I think, he wrote that 2-3 years later, he hit something in the North Sea in his battle cruiser, and then he realized, that was my old ship.
one of the things that kind of amazed me in going back over the history was that the given the lack of radar, given the lack of any kind of communication systems other than radio, but the Royal Navy had an idea of when, before this battle, of when uh, the Germans were going to start their movement, and they attempted, I think, to me a rather convoluted meetup where Beatty comes out of one port and Jellicoe and another group come out of two other ports in Scotland. Uh, Kind of talk about how the link up didn't work too well, mostly because it seemed to me that Beatty didn't really communicate effectively that he'd found the German uh, uh, battle fleet.
And the thing is, with the intelligence you refer to, the Admiralty in London, who had access to this information through Room 40, the famous Room 40, they had an inkling that something was on, but they weren't sure. So, at the end of the day, it was still essentially just a cruise for the Grand Fleet. But yeah, in retrospect, afterwards they realised that yes, BT was far too far away. Even for just a cruise, it wasn't a good idea.
I thought that was one of the interesting things about Jutland. When you look at how similar themes develop over time, and when you get that that Wikipedia deep view of it, or the first time you hear about it, all sorts of questions come up because most people are more familiar on the American side of the house with some of the naval actions in World War II. So people think about, well, what about aviation? What about reconnaissance? What's about SIGINT? And I want to back up again and let's talk about I think it was Captain Jackson and Room 40, because because we just got through with our Battle of Midway anniversary. Everybody likes to talk about how our signals intelligence really cracked the code and enabled us correctly with a few other pieces to get in a position to hijack the Japanese plans. And of course, we had aerial reconnaissance with the PBYs and the B-17s. It often gets lost in the shuffle, and everything kind of went right. But when you look at what happened in Room 40 with Captain Jackson and the signalist intelligence, and from an American point of view, when you look at aviation, there was actually, I think, an opportunity for a very modern change, because the British fleet actually had, I think, if she not one of the first aircraft carriers up in Scapa Flow that, for some JO, I guess, forgot to send the memo along, did not get underway until much later in the rest of the fleet and was told to go back. So there actually was some potential there for aviation, reconnaissance, cutting edge. And of course, the German Navy had their own Zeppelins, but they were kind of not a factor. So talk a little bit about what was missed on signal intelligence, and also what we now call air ISR, that could have helped supported the fleet and really made it a very modern engagement.
The signals intelligence bit is there's a bit of a, shall I say, controversy about that, because some people have vilified Thomas Jackson, who was the director of the operations division on the Admiralty War Staff. And this is a problem, whereas, of course, nowadays we would associate signals intelligence with the intelligence division. At that stage of the war, it was under the operations division, which did not work well, shall we say. But for some reason, the man who wrote a history of Room 40 after the war, he really had a chip on his shoulder about Thomas Jackson and made him out to be some sort of incompetent who hated all the code breakers. And then it turns out a captain in the United States Navy a few years ago did some research on this and found out that it was completely untrue. But Jackson may have been a SOB, but he did not, at that stage, he did not directly mishandle anything which could have helped the British fleet on 31st of May. Maybe in the night later on, but that's a different kettle of fish, because by then you had the chief of the Admiralty War Staff. He was directly involved, way above his pay grade perhaps, but he was a man called Sir Henry Oliver. And he loved doing things himself. He never delegated. And that's another point. You also have the Naval Secretary to the First Lord of the Admiralty involved keeping watch, and he's nothing to do with the Admiralty staff officially. He's like how can I put this? Aide to SecNav in the common parlance. So he shouldn't have even been anywhere near the code breakers, and yet there you are. So it was poorly organized, I think is the best way of putting it. And that directly had an effect on how Jellicoe in the Grand Fleet treated the information he was getting as the battle went on. He didn't know what to trust.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem. You say Beatty, I say Beatty, I don't know which one it is, but his mission was to scout, wasn't it, for the German fleet and advise Jellicoe of where he'd found him, when he found him?
Yep, that was his job. But just like in his previous action, which was Battle of Dogger Bank, his signalling left a lot to be desired. And for one reason or another, because if memory serves, his something went wrong. His wireless equipment was shot away, which isn't surprising given he was leading the battle line. But what he was sending back to Jellicoe just was too little and too late. So Jellicoe had all this, had a huge amount of responsibility of how to engage a fleet he didn't know was where it was coming from, how strong it was, and so on. And Beatty really let him down in that respect.
I have one of the great hobbies that I have in life is I like trolling around in used bookstores, and the older the better. And I found this book a few years ago. It's an American book, so it's based upon the American perspective. And I think what's interesting about it is it's relatively contemporaneous. This was published in 1918 in Boston by this guy Ralph D. Payne, called The Fighting Fleets. And it's not an unsubstantial book, over 300 pages, which the U.S. really didn't do that much in the war. But one of the interesting comments here, if I can find my bookmark. Bookmark actually seems to have fallen out. Hold on for a second. Okay. I will come back to that question after I reacquire the page that my bookmark fell out. Let me shift because it's related to this, so it'll come up later. We've mentioned a couple of the names here, but one of the ongoing parts of the discussion is the battle of the leadership and the reputation. On the Royal Navy side, you have Team Jellicoe and you have Team Beatty. And then on the German side, you had Scheer and Hipper. Their personalities and how they approached being leaders had a direct impact, and you touched a little bit on it, on how these fleets operated for better or worse. Talk for a little bit about the personalities and the drivers, and maybe the main habits that you saw in those four leaders that brought their ships to sea.
Well, I've got to admit I'm at a bit of a disadvantage about Scheer and Hipper, because as far as I'm aware, Hipper still only has one biography in English by an American called Tobias Philbin, and I don't know if anyone's written the biography of Scheer yet. I'm not sure.
That's amazing.
Whereas at least I know of at least two biographies of well, probably more actually, two of Alfred von Tirpitz, who is a man who is regarded as building the German fleet, but not the one who actually fought it. Scheer was relatively new in the job. If he'd been appointed earlier in 1916, I think, whereas Hipper had been in command. Hipper was literally the German Beatty. He'd been in command of their light forces for a long time. He had more control, I think, than Beatty did, when relatively speaking to the British fleet. And if memory serves again, sorry for using that term a lot, but I think Arthur Marder, the great American historian of the Royal Navy, he regarded Hipper as the outstanding naval leader of the war, I think, which is high praise indeed. Personality-wise for them, I can't really comment, I'm afraid to say, but all I can say is that the British did not underestimate the German side. And I've seen, actually, in the Admiralty papers at the National Archives in London, there is a report to Jellicoe from the Director of Naval Intelligence, and he's specifically saying, this is what we know about Admiral Scheer. You should know this. And there was a little bit, like, service history and whatnot, and a bit of personal information. So they made clear that the Admiralty wanted Jellicoe to know who he was up against. As for Jellicoe and Beatty, you've got the stereotypes. Jellicoe was a technocrat, if you will, but also thoroughly professional, knew what he was doing, knew what he wanted to do. Later characterized as being pessimistic and cautious, whereas Beatty was a flash Irishman who loved hunting in later life, treated his battle cruisers legendarily like a pack of hounds, and he is now considered to be reckless.
Yeah, I actually found it on page 290 of the Fighting Fleets, and this is just a few years after the battle, and here's a little extended quote. I'd be interested to get your comments on from the book. Quote, again from 1918. Quote, there is a notion rather widespread that the Grand Fleet has merely watched and waited inactively ever since the Battle of Jutland, contenting itself with a checkmate, its duty done so long as the Imperial German Navy is blockaded from the high seas. This is not the temper of a man who rules this mighty assemblage of naval force from the deck of his flagship. It is quite out of character to imagine Admiral Beatty sitting idly and twiddling his thumbs while he waits for something to happen. When the great opportunity offered itself, he held the German fleet with his battle cruisers until the English battle divisions could come up and pound the foe to pieces. Darkness prevented, or Admiral Jellicoe was a shade too cautious. Whichever side of the argument you prefer, in the greatest sea fight ever fought was inconclusive, unquote. This was written in 1918, but it could have been written 3 weeks ago with some of the stuff I read recently.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for 1918, that's pretty remarkable, really. But yes, well, it's a point of view anyway. Beatty did eventually lead the German fleet to Jellicoe, but dear God, for what a cost. He lost, given he started out with 6 battle cruisers, he lost 2 of them. And he notoriously didn't bring his supporting force, the 5th Battle Squadron, into action as early as he could have done. He let the Germans fire first, which is mind-boggling, given that the whole point of British, the whole, philosophy of British design and construction had been to outgun the enemy and use the longer range of the bigger gun. So for Beatty to throw that advantage away is it defies comprehension, actually, still. And yet people still praise him for his some people praise him for his handling of a battle cruiser fleet at Jutland.
Yeah, it's hard to look at the record as you go through this to see that he did much right. And his, I don't know whether it was, I couldn't have been facetious, but the comment he made during the battle that there seems to be something wrong with our ships today or whatever. I mean, that just is mind-boggling that he would, in the middle of a fight, watching two of his battle cruisers being blown to bits and the loss of, what, 2,000 men, just kind of make that comment.
Yeah, and it's also quite weird that they were both members of his staff who recorded him saying that, and they thought they were doing him a favour by putting it in print. But there is one thing about which I've done a lot of research on Beatty over the years, and you can see in his papers and in his staff's papers, but he wasn't an idiot. He was conscientiously trying to do the right thing in his fleet. He was, doing proper staff work. Believe it or not, he was actually focusing on gunnery and improving it. And yet, when it came to 31st of May 1916, he just really screwed the pooch, as the saying goes. As you said, what more could he have done wrong? It's interesting, really.
It's always a challenge to go from theory to practice. And, as one thing we share with the mother country right now is we have a problem building ships and ships that are fit for purpose in a timely manner inside a schedule. And one thing I found interesting, and those who are with me live, they're gonna see it come up here, is when I looked at the major capital ships. It gets unwieldy if you go past your capital ships in the battle. The one thing that struck my mind, and it makes sense in a way, is how young both fleets were. The average age of the capital ships, when I say capital ships, I'm talking about the battleships and the battle cruisers. And for the Germans, I went ahead and threw in their dreadnoughts as well. But the average age of the capital ships that took place in the battle from the Royal Navy were only 3.8 years old. The German ships on average were a little bit older at 4.9 years old. And the Battle of Tsushima that everybody looks at, well, this is what made us had the Dreadnought. That took place in 1905. HMS Dreadnought keel was laid, I think, in 2005. So from what I've read, the Royal Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the American Navy had already figured out that big guns was the way to go. And then, the Germans were right behind them as well. But you look at these fleets, they were so incredibly young, and they were produced very, very fast, and late industrial age technology and with much smaller populations. And when you look at these capital ships that were produced in such a short period of time in such volume, and some of whom, like the Warspite, she kept serving until the end of World War II. It makes you think a little bit about our military industrial complex, shipbuilding industry, and how much in a century nations can really shift from one side to another, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the achievement is well, I say achievement because obviously it pales into comparison with what the United States did in the Second World War. But for peacetime, it wasn't bad going. Like you say, I mean, the oldest British dreadnought that Jutland was 8 years old, I think, or had been commissioned, not even 8 years, 7 years earlier. Whereas nowadays, that's for building time for some ships.
It is.
One of the reasons I looked at Jutland was you were, there was an article, X post, whatever you call them, tweet from Hidden History about Admiral Beatty, and you had responded talking about apparently the allegation was made that the reason that the those two cruisers blew up was because they had cordite running loose in near their gun, and there's some evidence, I would guess, that in order to get the speed of fire they wanted, maybe they did cheat a little bit, but you said that was cordite bit is drivel disseminated by rubbish historians, which I thought was that piqued my interest. So talk a little bit about that. What is there any truth at all to the cordite concept causing the demise of those two cruisers?
Well, Cordite, because it was Beatty lost two under him, and then a third one was sunk, which was attached to Jellicoe's force later in the day, and they were all lost to catastrophic magazine explosions. And many people have speculated over the years, or just not speculated, outright stated, that it was because they were stacking the propellant for the guns outside the magazines. Some people have said it was because they had increased the amount which was being carried. Others have said no, it's just because they wanted easier access to it. And then tying into this is usually an argument that it was because Beatty wanted to increase the rate of fire. And the further corollary to that is he wanted to increase the rate of fire because he couldn't practice long-range gunnery from where he was at Rosyth, near Edinburgh. And at the end of the day, there is very little evidence for this. It was a terribly designed system where, in order to get the propellant out of the magazines into the loading cycle, you literally had to open the magazine door, which some would say is a terrible, terrible design flaw. And I think really it's as simple as that.
I guess in some way it's easier to go after, a technical or a training shortfall than it is, kind of what you talked about before is some of the decisions of the leaders in place. Because when you look at the Royal Navy, for every 3 capital ships they sortied forward, the Germans only had 2. And when you look at the relative damage between the two, if you're doing one of these war games on paper and you're rolling dice, it's not that the German fleet got all the good rolls per se, but do you think that a lot of the relative success that the Germans had to do with the technical aspects of their fleet, even though it was older, or did the German officers that happened to be in charge at that point in time, did they just make better tactical decisions, or it could just be blind, stupid luck, which always plays in these things?
I'm sure I'll annoy a lot of your listeners when I say I've come to the conclusion over the years that luck really does play a massive part in all this, because, I mean, just look at years later, you've got HMS Hood. That goes down, which I think that's just blind luck in the end, for example. And don't get me wrong, the Germans were handled very well tactically, although every so often you do get them. I mean, Hipper did several turnaways. Beatty did a turnaway, that kind, when you fear overwhelming odds or something's going against you, you turn away from the enemy. That's what many commanders did. Jellicoe notoriously did it later in the day when the Germans launched a massive torpedo attack. He turned his fleet away a few degrees and lost touch. And then you've got the Germans with Scheer with his 2 massive turns away, his famous battle turnarounds, where every ship turns around at the same time. There was a surprising amount of retreating going on during the day.
as I read some of the history, it looked to me like the Germans had far better fire control mechanisms. So and which may account for the fact that they were pretty they were on target a lot with. I mean, I don't know how many rounds they fired to get the effect they got, but they seemed to be shooting really well. But at the time, the Royal Navy did not have that kind of fire control system. Am I mistaken on that?
There is again another large controversy which has been going on for 30, 40 years now about fire control in the British Navy. There are some who say that what most British ships were like the actual fire control computer, similar to the Ford Rangekeeper in American ships and things like that. The fire control computers were alleged to be rubbish, which the Royal Navy actually had, whereas there was a man from civilian life who had a much better system, which was rejected, and was then plagiarized poorly by both the British and the Americans. Whereas I would disagree with that, really. To be honest, I'd say that if memory serves from what a man called John Campbell wrote a book called Jutland, an analysis of the fighting, and he worked out that if you compared different stages of the battle, and the rate of hitting was roughly similar in certain points, depending on who was firing. So really, there wasn't much in it, if you see what I'm getting at, when it comes to actual hits and rates of hitting.
When you look at the Battle of Jutland beforehand, it was clear that while both sides, and I think what was his name on the German side, it was Hugo von Pohl, who was originally with the fleet that was told by the Kaiser, protect my navy, don't unnecessarily risk it. And then they had change of command after him. They got a better brief to the Kaiser, and he said, "Yeah, go do what you want to do." But there was a series of raids that I think it was just the battle cruisers from the German fleet did up and down the coast of England, trying to bait the high seas fleet to come out to play, so to speak. And it's interesting to read through this because after a while, it can't really find a good explanation in the context of the larger war that was going on, literally from the North Sea down to Arabia, that a big clash of fleets in the North Sea from a strategic point of view, where would that have advantaged the Germans to get the larger fleet to come out and play? It almost seems as if it was an isolated theater on its own, playing under its own theories and rules, as opposed to part of a large integrated plan that may have existed somewhere.
That's a good question, actually. I'd have to. Sadly, I don't have a physical copy of there's a Canadian called Holger Herwig who has written extensively on the German fleet and its usage and whatnot. But the title of one of his books is from a famous line by Churchill, who dismissively referred to the German high sea fleet as a luxury fleet, which did not go down well with anyone, especially the Kaiser or the German Navy. And, like I say, what they wanted to, I've forgotten the German name for it now, but they did want to try and destroy the British fleet piecemeal. But then, as you said, there were directives say protect the fleet. So it was a bit To be fair, the British Navy wasn't much better either in that respect, because it had some limitations placed upon it too. So it was all it was all a delicate balance between risking it and preserving it.
Well, how much was that tied to the? It seems that the Germans had much more of a interdiction of commerce mission in mind to begin with, and the Royal Navy was tasked with blockading the Germans. So I mean, there's slight differences there, but the only way the Germans could interdict commerce, except for as we now know, their rather successful submarine programs, was to break that fleet out, be able to get out into the open ocean. So, I mean, how much does that play into the and of course, then the cost of these navies was huge for that day, and when I can't even imagine what it would cost today to have fleets that size. Um, I guess we'll know from the Chinese someday. But I mean, there are two different missions there, if I read my history correctly.
Well, I'm trying to think of how many ships the Germans actually got to break for blockade, and it can't be many. A mix of actually, I'm not sure if any big German ships got out of the North Sea, other than I stand to be corrected on that, but maybe things like converted merchantmen and smaller ships, and of course they had his name, the chap who commanded a sailing ship, and used her as a commerce interdictor. But yeah, I mean, look at the Royal Navy, the British Navy. They had fleets of cruisers around the world, which it turned out sorted the job extremely quickly, and then were just languishing overseas for years until convoys were started. In retrospect, that could have been seen as a waste of money.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the only, German combatants that really were able to get out and raise a ruckus was the SNS Emden that got permission from Spey when they were getting out of China to go cruise through the Indian Ocean and raise havoc. And then, of course, there was Spey's. I mean, you talk about a suicide run that they made a mess of the Falklands, but they didn't make it much northern than that. And the one very distant connection I have to all this, my paternal grandfather was a seaman on the USS Arkansas that after the U.S. joined the war, joined the Grand Fleet up in Scapa Flow for the last year of the war or so. And right after the Battle of Jutland, I thought was really interesting is it was decided that everything, we were talking about the caution. You said, well, maybe the British had the same caution. Is it was decided that everything south of 50.5 north, which for those on this side of the pond, that's roughly the border between England and Scotland across to Norway, that it was too dangerous to go south of there. And so the rest of the war, the fleet pretty much hung out in the not so warm embrace of the Orkneys and the Shetlands until the war ended.
Yeah, I think there's they always caveated things like that, though. It's like, yeah, you can only go so far unless there's a really good reason. And was it April 1918 when the Germans went out? The German fleet went out one big time, but then, and this was one of the times where Room 40 had no idea it was going to happen because the Germans had finally learned to shut up over the radio web. And the only way the British found out was when one of the German battle cruisers, I can't remember, did she hit a mine or get torpedoed or something? It was the SMS Moltke. And then, can't remember if she was still in command then, but whoever was in charge decided, yeah, we better turn around. This isn't good. And so possibly, if it'd been, who knows, it could have been another fleet action in 1918. And then maybe everyone would have gone south of that line 50 degrees.
Yeah, 55.5 north. I was off by 5 degrees of latitude, so I failed my navigation quiz.
I think one of the things about the battle too. I mean, I was looking a little while ago at the mines, the mine barrage, as they say, that covered up the north, almost the whole North Sea exit. And one of the concerns Jellicoe had, he, as you say, he had a reputation for being cautious, but one of the concerns he had about going too far in the pursuit of the German fleet was that he didn't know where the mines were, or if he did know, he was concerned about getting sucked into a fight that he didn't see any real gain from going there. Talk a little bit about the mines and their impact on this Battle of Jutland.
That's a good question. As I'm trying to, that was one of Jellicoe's fears, was that when the Germans did their battle turnaway, for example, and or it was, dare I say it was used as an excuse later on anyway. But wherever the Germans led, Jellicoe fears that he would either be led across German minefields, or the Germans had mine layers with them and would lay mines in the path. Which, like I said before, the British did not underestimate the Germans at all. All this stuff about Germany is a young nation, they've got a young navy. I think it was the gunnery expert, Percy Scott, British gunnery expert, who said that the Germans will be easy to beat. It's like they've been trained on the Serpentine, which is a little reservoir in London. And Jellicoe was very creative, and not creative, but like I say, he did not underestimate what the Germans might do. So that certainly shaped his thinking.
Next to the mines, the one thing that caught my attention is before the battle, the Germans, which are always kind of leaning forward in the submarine area in both world wars, they actually had a pretty good plan that they were going to catch the Germans with not a mine barrage, but a submarine barrage, a very modern kind of tactic that I think worked out a lot better in the Second World War. But they also had their mine laying submarines that actually succeeded in sinking one after the battle. But that's a great, known unknown, is that plan that the Germans had for their submarines to intercept the British fleet as it came south was really decades ahead of its time in some regards. But one thing I didn't see anywhere was the British submarine services during the Battle of Jutland. I don't think they were part of anybody's plan, relative to the German submarine service. In 2016, what was the British view of submarines, and was there a reason that you've seen anywhere about why that's not even an asterisk on the British effort?
Yet again, if memory serves, the British were waiting on their fast submarines, which could operate with the fleet, and that's where you get the infamous K-class steam-powered submarine, which comes into service a year after Jutland or so, which were meant to be fast enough to steam into action with the fleet and then submerge and wreak havoc upon the enemy. That was the logic there. As to why they weren't actually in that area of the North Sea, the submarines which the British had, I'm assuming it's yet again down to mines, and there's so much can go wrong in that area of the sea. Plus, if it's well, it's also very shallow around there, if memory serves. It's why you've got the famous photo of HMS Invincible with both ends sticking out for water after she blew up. So I don't know if that's a good operating environment for a submarine.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting because I know that during the Battle of Helgoland, I'll probably get that one mispronounced too, but they used the Royal Navy used three of its submarines to kind of lure the Germans out, and it was so that was what, a couple of years, maybe a year before maybe 2 years before this fight.
Yeah, I think Heligoland bite was end of August 1914, so very early in the war, and then I'm guessing the Germans, everyone involved thought, yeah, we're not going to get that lucky again, because the Germans got fairly mauled, because Beatty's battle cruisers were there, and there was battle cruisers versus light cruisers, and I wouldn't say it was a massacre, but it was also, what's the famous saying, it's like smashing an egg with a sledgehammer. Which, well, if you want to be sure of getting anything done, it's the right way to do it. But also, again, that was early on, before the submarines had really come into their own, and also more German surface craft too.
What aspect or lesson or experience when you look at the Battle of Jutland from 2026, do you think most informs some of the concerns or challenges or priorities we're trying to get right here in 2026?
The biggest lesson I would take from all of this is always make sure you've got the biggest fleet. That's the main takeaway. So the Germans could justifiably say, yeah, we've bloodied the British fleet's nose, but 24 hours, 2 days after the battle, the British had a hell of a lot more ships ready to go to sea and fight than the Germans. And they knew it as well, because even though Scheer in his report to the Kaiser said, oh yes, we've inflicted a great blow upon the British, and paraphrasing here, he also said this is not the way to strike a decisive blow, because he knew he would never be able to do that, however good his ships were or his crews.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting since the World Cup is on, and we're beginning to see that sometimes a draw, which I think many people would think the Battle of Jutland was, is just as good as a win. The Jellicoe and Beatty did achieve the goal of keeping the Germans from going back out to sea in any serious way.
Yeah, it's also just to my mind, it just shows we can. We may convince ourselves, I'm sure most people aren't, but we can convince ourselves, oh, any potential foes aren't as well trained as we are, and their machinery isn't as good as ours, but I think, numbers have a mass all of their own is just crucial at the end of the day.
I think it's also interesting that you can have a continental power that the German Empire was, and the Kaiser built a navy to compete with his cousin, and it was a nice fleet, a good fleet, an impressive fleet, and from whether you're talking about the nice Zeiss rangefinders and everything else. But at the end of the day, I think you made a really good point. Is you can have all the shortfalls, whether it's here or there with the Royal Navy, and if you look at it strictly on the paper, uh, the Germans sunk some ships, some really beautiful ships, but afterwards, mass matters, numbers matter. The old, not just the ability to fight hurt, but okay, fine, you sunk a lot of my ships, but I have a lot more to take them place. That's a not insignificant thing. It also in the great scheme of things with the Great War, I think I wrote it down somewhere. The casualties was, for both sides was a little bit under 10,000, 823 was the number I got up with. But there were 2 Royal Navy casualties for every 1 Imperial Navy casualty. But for the rest of the war, besides their submarines, that big, beautiful fleet that Germany pre-war had invested so much money in it, because it could not operationally go out there and take hits like that again, I guess the only big impact it had afterwards was, well, 2 of them, I think. One was the German Navy revolt towards the end of the war that had a lot of second and third order effects. And then you had the scuttling of the fleet afterwards, which really shows 2 different sides of the fleet. You had the revolutionary, we don't want to die for no reason fleet, and also for the honor of Germany, you can't have our fleet, we'd rather sink it. I don't know, Simon, what do you, even from a British point of view, when you look at that fleet that went from a good, honorable fight at the Battle of Jutland to, at the end of the war, going from rebellion to scuttling, what's the view of that fleet? And if it couldn't have been something else, was it really the best investment the Germans could have done?
It's one of those great what ifs, isn't it? Because everyone talks about the British two-power standard, for example, and the Naval Defence Act of 1889. But then the Kaiser essentially copied that when he went in for his naval laws, which is what really set us off down the ridiculous naval arms race. And so I think before the outbreak of war, we're on 2 keels to 1 when it came to capital ships, which is ridiculous, really. And Britain tried to, what's the word, encourage the holiday, naval holiday, but the Germans didn't want it. So it's just a waste, really. And it's one of many things which turned Britain from being a friend of Germany into, well, not just antagonists, but then full-blown enemy. And look where we ended up.
Yeah. Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left. Where can people find what you're up to these days, Simon? And what are you working on?
They can find me on X/Twitter and the handle @Simon Harley. They can they can have a look at the Dreadnought project, which I regret to say I've not worked on as much lately, but there's always something to plug in. And for the last few years, I've just been working on what was meant to be a book. First it was an article, then it turned into a book, looking at why the British battle cruisers sank at the Battle of Jutland. But that turned into an absolute minefield, shall I say, because I realised that, actually, I've got to look at everything. I have to look at the history of the battle cruiser. I have to look at staff organisation. I have to look at ship design. I have to look at gunnery. So many different things piled in, so I've become an expert on God knows how many things now. And at the end of the day, I'm still, like I said earlier, a lot of what happened at Jutland is just pure luck, which isn't very scientific.
But I think it's an honest answer. It's one of those things also on the American side of the house when we like to talk about the Battle of Midway. When you take a deep breath and you look at it, a lot of that victory came from just blind, stupid luck, which is a non-zero factor in war more often than not. Simon, really appreciate you investing an hour of your time today to talk about Jutland. Really, really appreciate your observations and comments.
Well, thanks very much for having me, guys.
So it's been great. We have a lot of things to contemplate as a result of doing this work, and I think you hit on a lot of it. The size of the Chinese fleet that we worry about, and how we tend to look down on them as being new at the game. That's a deep concern. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us for another edition of Mid-Rats. And until next time, hope you have a great Navy day. Cheers.
Maloney wants to marry me, and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me silly, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but